Welcome back to the second lecture on French absolutism in the 17th century. And at the end of the last lecture, we left off with this slide with various representations of Louis XIV as a god. And the one really iconic symbol is in the lower right, the Sun King figure. And he is known in French as Le Roi Soleil. The sun being the center of the universe. And this is also in the post-Copernican period. So in 1543, Copernicus published a major work on the revolutions of heavenly bodies, in which he argued that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the universe. So I think it's fitting that in the 17th century, Louis adopts the sun as his symbol, and artists try to use that symbol, sculptors, artists, etc. So we're going to move forward today with Louis XIV and begin to examine the different ideas that went into making Louis an absolutist ruler. And I think one of the first things we are going to encounter is architecture. And architecture is really going to be important in the vocabulary of absolutism. And you see here pictured the palace at Versailles. This was going to become Louis's principal residence, but not before it had been rebuilt and greatly expanded. So the palace, in fact, starts out as a hunting lodge, rather small, modest structure under Louis XIII. And Louis XIV, after the troubles of the Fronde and having had to flee Paris, is going to decide to relocate his court from the Louvre Palace in the heart of Paris, that is. He's going to relocate to Versailles, a town about 10 miles outside of Paris. So it's a rather interesting decision. And he builds this rather large structure, which took some 20 years to enlarge and rebuild. Some 30,000 workmen labored on this structure, and it was truly a magnificent and grandiose structure that was supposed to inspire awe and this sense of majesty. And you can see a couple of the rooms on the right. There's a drawing on the left there, obviously, but the Palace of Mirrors, it's going to be the site of important events in future European history. And you can see one of the bedrooms in the palace itself. And you notice the names of the two key architects, Louis Lavaux and Jules Ardan Mansart, are the two main architects who were responsible for this building project. Now, the size of the palace also had political implications. The palace had to be big enough to house not only Louis and his family, but in fact all of the major nobles from across France. And Louis actually insisted that all the major noble families come to live in Versailles. And you might ask why. Well, it was a way that Louis saw he could keep closer tabs on his nobles and actually control the nobility by forcing them to reside at his palace. And that was really to keep the nobles in check. Louis, again, having lived through the Fronde and the revolt, really feared the nobles and did not want them to rebel or be a source of trouble. So he invites and or insists that they come to live at Versailles. So this is a rather interesting approach. We don't see this in England and not in other places in Europe either. And I've already talked about the palace and how it was decorated with portraits and statues that reinforced Louis's image as the dominant Sun King, and everywhere you'll find images of the sun. At the very center of the palace was the king's own bedchamber, and in this bedchamber, there was the idea of the daily routine, the king's daily routine. So every day started with the getting up of the king, the lever du roi, so the waking up and getting up and dressing of the king. And this was a moment in which nobles could assist the king in a formal and elaborate ritual of both prayers, dressing, washing, and conducting business of the state all at the same time. And nobles would fight to be invited to the waking up ceremony, if you will, because that was a time when they were actually very close to the king and could ask for favors. So it was a very important moment, and the king would grant favors to the nobility that were there. So this elaborate series of rituals each and every day, a very structured and ordered life, and that was really meant to keep chaos at bay and to reinforce the king as the center of life at the palace, but also in the nation of France. Now that might seem odd to us. So in reality, one might think it would be really good to be the king and have this large palace, yet he's surrounded by people always, at every moment of the day practically. So there's little to no privacy whatsoever for the king. And as I said, it was also important for the nobles who could ask for favors or present petitions to the kings, so that the king was able to run his nation by hearing petitions, by granting favors, and by keeping tabs on the great nobility. Now, Louis conducted most of his formal work of governing France in the morning hours, and the afternoons were reserved for royal hunting on the palace grounds and the playing of games, and the evening was reserved for watching plays and operas, gambling. Louis loved to play cards, and later in the evening there was a formal dinner in which an army of servants prepared elaborate dishes and served them to the king and his court. And it's often said that the king ate alone at a table in front of everybody, and everybody watched the king eat. So everybody watches him get up and bathe and dress and pray, and everybody watches him eat, and then everybody, of course, is going to watch him go to bed. So it's a rather odd thing, I think, for us today to imagine. But this was, again, these intricate rituals that played out each and every day. And I think the idea is this is not only Louis's egotism, but it was a way that Louis was able to keep control and exercise, again, that idea of absolute power. So when you can call people to watch you do everything each and every moment of every day, I would suggest that that's a sign of one's power. And again, this made sense in the world of the 17th century. And in fact, the king had this famous expression that he uttered, or is reputed to have uttered, and that is "L'État c'est moi," and that is the state is me. So Louis in himself is the embodiment of the state, also a representative of God on earth. So going back to that steward idea that we encountered. And here, I guess you see some moments of the day that I pictured. The king waking up there on the left, and somebody is actually tying his shoe. You can see that would be, again, a great privilege for a noble to actually tie the king's shoe, which sounds kind of odd and funny to us, but nonetheless, you can see the king in the afternoon up above on the right-hand side, out in the gardens of Versailles for some occasion, some social occasion gathering. And then you can see the king with his son above him. The king is seated, and the son, the Dauphin, is behind him, and he's greeting people in the palace of Versailles. So again, that idea of order and structure keeps chaos at bay and is a symbol of his power. Now, Louis could not do everything himself. He couldn't attend to every detail, every policy. So he assembled a corps of professional lawyers and bankers and merchants who were not noble by birth. And these men, who had the professional skills, were going to help Louis craft his policies and implement those policies in France. And this was going to help make France a stable nation. That is, there wouldn't be infighting among nobles or these destructive civil wars that we saw with regards to religion. And France is going to become a more prosperous nation, as we have, again, bankers and merchants beginning to help the king craft economic policies that are going to help grow the economy. And as chief minister, really, he didn't have really a prime minister like Cardinal Richelieu or Cardinal Mazarin, as we saw with previous kings, but he did have a finance minister, and he's pictured here, and his name is Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and he was going to help Louis create a network of trained bureaucrats who were then going to be sent out across France to implement the policies. So it's not going to be the nobility or the local gentry, and that's something we saw in England. England and the English Stuart kings never really had a large network of bureaucrats that worked directly for them. in France, we see this network of bureaucrats working directly for the king, and the nobility are going to really kind of be sidelined. So that's quite a difference. And again, I think when we talk about absolutism and the exercise of power, having people work directly for you that are not noble by birth, therefore they're not going to represent the same threat and challenge. So this is how another way that Louis is able to exercise this idea of royal power that we talked about. The king must be in control, and he is very much in control, in addition to being godlike. So those five features of absolutism that I mentioned in the first lecture. So one thing I just want to kind of point out here is that recent historians have cautioned, however, against the idea of thinking of absolutism as total control. So there is no total control in the early modern period, and that's really because there isn't the means to exercise total control. In other words, we don't have communication devices, the ability to spread messages via radio, via newspapers, via today TV, internet. So the idea that a ruler could exercise total control is not really going to come about until the 20th century. So here we have absolute control. And that means Louis doesn't totally control everything. In France, there are still nobles, there's still the clergy, and there's still the peasantry. And there's still these courts called the Parlement that cause so much trouble with the Fronde. So they continue to exist. And Louis, I think, to his credit, understood that his authority did have certain limits, and that he had to make arrangements and concessions to the older orders that existed in France. So I think here we can see then that the king's personality and temperament was ideally suited to his situation. So he doesn't insist, he doesn't make demands that are unreasonable, he doesn't push, any kind of understands again what he's up against, and makes decisions accordingly. Something that, for example, Charles I in England, who really didn't seem to have that personality and temperament to understand the idea of moderation, or the politique idea that we've seen in past lectures. So I think that's just an interesting thing to look at. Now, you can also see that the idea of the art of taxation that Colbert says consists of plucking the goose so as to obtain the most feathers with the least hissing. So Colbert is going to help Louis maximize tax revenues to pay for the construction of the large palace, and later then we're going to see the creation of a very large army that's going to cost a lot of money. So let's see. France is going to, under Colbert's guidance, develop a system known as mercantilism. So it's an economic system, and I think you can look at that picture up there, and the idea of mercantilism is quite simple, that a nation wants to export more goods than it imports. If you're going to export goods, then you have to also manufacture those goods. So it presupposes developing manufacturing industries to then export surplus goods to other nations, and then import as little as possible, so that you create a favorable balance of trade. And when you do that, it's possible to really accumulate wealth. And when a nation can accumulate wealth, it can then build infrastructure, it can pay for an army, it can support colonial expansion, and it can support wars, as we saw France do in the 30 Years' War. So this is really the goal that Colbert, as the finance minister, is going to help Louis achieve, and they're quite successful. Now, however, we're going to see that France, at a certain point in time, begins to get itself involved in a very aggressive foreign policy, which leads to a series of wars. And again, wars are costly, but they're also disruptive to trade and economic activity. So that's going to be one of those things that we see kind of recurring throughout history. We saw that with Elizabeth I, who was largely successful until she got herself involved with a series of wars with Spain, and we saw that with the Stuarts as well. So So how is France going to pay for it all? Well, in part, it's going to continue to collect taxes, especially from the peasantry, but it's going to, again, and I want to emphasize this, develop its economy. And again, mercantilism is unlike free market capitalism in that you do not rely on individuals to undertake economic activity freely. It is the state that manages, that organizes, that oversees the running of an economy. So a very different type of system than we're used to in the United States. One might think of, say, China today, where the Chinese state and government actually play a large role in managing the economy, although they have adopted and embraced capitalist techniques. And the Chinese state has been very successful, and they've accumulated large sums of money, which they can use then to finance infrastructure projects or foreign policy. So in that way, I think there's some continuity, again, that we talked about, or that we're talking a lot about. So some of the industries that Colbert actually helped create in France were perfume industries, fine china, and tapestries. So these are all luxury goods that France is going to begin to manufacture and then export to other nations in Europe. And Colbert also created quality standards, quality control for these new industries, and he promoted the training of workers and artisans to, again, ensure that high degree of quality. So we see the direct hand of the national state in organizing all aspects of the economy. And again, that's really kind of odd and foreign to us today. So, and one last thing, Colbert began to finance voyages of exploration and colonization to the New World for France, and that would be North America and Canada. And these overseas possessions or colonial possessions would serve two purposes. The first, they would be a source of raw materials for French manufacturing. And secondly, colonial possessions would also provide new markets for finished goods coming from France. So France is going to quickly get itself involved in New World colonization, as the Spanish had done. And again, that's going to bring the French into conflict with the English, who are also going to be doing the same thing at roughly the same time. And we're going to see in the 18th century, the 1700s, a series of wars between England and France, and at some point they involve North America, and that's the 7 Years' War as we know it in the United States. So one of the other things, before I move on, is that Colbert tried to get the nobles to also pay taxes, but this plan didn't go anywhere as the nobles resisted this idea. So Colbert at some point also had to greatly increase taxes on the peasants, and they had always borne the greatest tax burden in France, and this is going to cause resistance to taxes, and the peasants are going to be unhappy, obviously, about having to pay for this. And that's going to be a problem that continues to linger, and it will resurface in future moments, particularly when we look at the French Revolution. All right, so one of the other things that we encountered was the idea of a large army. And this is something that the king is going to King Louis the XIV is going to create, and he creates this large army in order to carry out his policies, project his power and his majesty, to keep control inside France, so the army can be used as sort of a domestic police force, and also to project French power outside in the larger international state system that we see emerging from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Louis took a very scientific approach to this, and we're going to see that the idea of science, I already mentioned Copernicus earlier with the idea of the sun-centered universe. We're going to see that the 17th century is a time of great scientific advancement, the techniques of science, how we study things, and then what we do with the results from our studies. And Louis commissioned a series of studies that looked at how to improve the army, how to modernize the army, if you will, how to make fortifications fortifications better, how to fight better, deploy troops in a better, more efficient and effective way. And he then creates an army of professional soldiers. They're going to serve 4-year terms of enlistments. They're also going to receive good and regular pay. And this was really to avoid soldiers who in the past would sack and plunder towns when they were not paid. The soldiers are going to be provided with military training using new weapons and tactics of war. And this really takes the military duty away from the nobility, who had always exercised that duty going back to the medieval period, and fulfilled this role of defending the nation. And it's going to shift that responsibility of defending the nation to the king's army, that is going to be made up of, yes, some nobles, of course, in the officer ranks and the cavalry, no question, but also there's going to be now a large number of foot soldiers who are common people who see the military as a way to advance themselves and provide greater means for their family. So I think this is going to be an important shift away from, again, the nobility to a different type of fighting force. Something we also saw, by the way, in England, the idea of the New Model Army and the Roundheads of Oliver Cromwell. Again, non-noble fighting force, fighting for the nation. Now, here in France, we're not talking about a religious minority, and we're not talking about fighting for ideas. They're really fighting to carry out the king's will and to defend France. Now, the king is going to obviously need a lot of money to pay for this army. And again, that goes back to the economic development and the taxation. And Louis, by the end of his reign, is going to have an army numbering some 300,000 men. And it becomes one of Europe's largest and greatest fighting forces. And it allows France to really project its power. And as I said earlier, France is going to get itself involved in a series of wars with just about every power in Europe, and France is often going to have to go it alone, but it has this massive army. So that is that. So the King Louis does have this massive army. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is religion, and that's one of the other things that we mentioned with royal absolutism, is the idea of religious conformity. And it became clear to Louis and his advisors and his court that having a minority sect, the Huguenots, tolerated in France, that could worship publicly, that could fortify its towns, presented a challenge to Louis's rule, or at least his idea of rule. And that is, the Huguenots really kind of represented a state within a state, and that was a limitation on Louis's absolute power. So Louis does something very similar. He revokes the Edict of Nantes, and you see there the Edit du Roi portant suppression des Edits de Nantes et de Nîmes. So he's going to revoke the Edict of Nantes in October of 1685. You can see the date there, October 22nd, 1685. The Parlement of Paris is going to record formally this edict, and this is going to set off a mass exodus of Huguenots in France. Now, unfortunately for Louis, the unintended consequences of this were, yes, it reinforces his royal absolutism, and France is going to have one king and one faith, and also one law, the king's law. But the Huguenots didn't take this lightly, and many of them decided to leave. Now, the Huguenots, as we had already discussed in the Wars of Religion, were by this time in the 17th century fairly successful merchants. They're professionals, so these are the bankers, these are the lawyers, and the merchants that Colbert had relied on to really drive the French economy. And so when they leave en masse, they take with them their skills, they take with them their know-how, and this is going to weaken France greatly. And where do they go? So they go to the Netherlands, they go to some of the German principalities that were Protestant, they go to England, and some of them actually cross over the Atlantic Ocean and come to North America. So this is going to really be a huge drain on the French nation in the name of religious purity. And we'll see this again in the 1930s when we look at the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and their treatment of Jews, and those Jews that were able to get out and flee tended to be very highly educated scientists and lawyers, etc., bankers. And so there's what's called a brain drain, and the policy in the end left France a weaker nation at the very time when France is involved in wars with just about every European power. So Louis here was probably short-sighted, but he did achieve his goal of suppressing the Huguenot minority in France. So France is not going to have religious toleration or freedom of conscience, something we saw develop quite clearly in England. So we see a very different approach. Now, we're going to end this lecture, and then you can read more about this in the textbook, but Louis's Wars. So the road to greater glory, territory, and power for Louis XIV led through Spanish territories. And if you look at this map, it's a German map actually, but it does the job quite nicely. You can see that France is that sort of blue purplish color. Just to the north and east of France, in that yellow orangish color, is the Spanish Netherlands. And to above that, in that sort of salmon color, are the Dutch independent Netherlands. So remember that Spain still controls a sizable amount of territory in Northern Europe. They also control the Franche-Comté. So again, you see that the Spanish are in some sense still circling the French, and this is going to be one of Louis's major goals, foreign policy goals, is to break the Spanish encirclement, and he's going to launch a series of wars. And he also launches a war against the Netherlands, because the Netherlands by this time had become a very wealthy trading republic. So they're not absolutists, they don't have kings, they're a republic, they're very successful, very wealthy, and Louis felt like he could just simply conquer the Netherlands and take over their trading empire and greatly enrich France in the process. So he's going to fight wars against the Spanish and in the Spanish Netherlands. He's going to fight wars against the Dutch, and those are and these wars that he fights in the 1660s and 70s. And you can see the list of wars there: the War of Devolution, the war against the Netherlands, then the 9 Years' War against the League of Augsburg, and then finally the War of Spanish Succession are going to draw in all the major powers of Europe. But that's his goal. Louis's goal is to break the Habsburg encirclement. And then at some point, he also had ambitions and ideas that he himself might even be the next king of Spain. And that's really because the Spanish king Carlos II was without children, and so therefore there's going to be a vacancy in the Spanish throne. Louis the 14th had married the Spanish princess Maria Henrietta in 1659, so he felt like he had, through this dynastic marriage, a claim to the Spanish throne. And so that's really going to motivate, again, Louis's foreign policy and his decisions to go to war. Now, Louis also thought that Carlos II would die much sooner than he actually did. He had been a somewhat sickly king, and he thought that Carlos would not last that long. It turns out Carlos actually lives until 1700, far longer than Louis had expected. So Louis had begun these wars back in 1667 with the idea that at some point Carlos would have died, and he would then be able to himself possibly take the throne. Yet Louis's plans are also going to be frustrated by the Dutch. He's not able to conquer the Dutch as he thought he could do, and that's in large part because of geography and the terrain in the Netherlands. They're a low-lying country. That's what the country's name means, Netherlands, low-lying, and the Dutch were able to, at some point, open up the dikes and flood lands that really kind of made it very difficult, if not impossible, for the French army to continue its invasion. So the Dutch are able to repel the French, also with the help of the English and some of the Holy Roman Empire, the Protestant principalities. So that's going to be the story there, and we're going to see Louis the 14th continue The idea of trying to assert French power. And it's interesting, again, that old Habsburg idea of European dominion, that is one ruler, one faith, really seems to have resurfaced in Louis XIV. So while the Habsburgs failed, we're going to see that Louis XIV, the Bourbon family, is going to give it a go, I think, and I think he's going to come up short and fail ultimately. And despite France's large army, they're simply not able to overcome the combined forces. And especially if you look at the League of Augsburg, Spain, England, Sweden, the Netherlands, the whole Roman Empire, they're just not able to actually conquer all of those nations that joined forces together. And I think what this says is that out of the 17th century, there is the international state system, and there is this idea of a balance of power. And that's going to continue to be something that we'll talk about, the balance of power in the European state system. So you can see Louis's the various wars. Now Louis is able to cobble together additional territories for France, and you can see those in that sort of darker, I want to say mauve color. I'm not very good with colors, but you can see that he is able to add territories to France through these wars, although he never achieves his overall objective. And again, you can read a little bit about this more in your textbook, but the last war itself, the War of Spanish Succession, is going to end in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht. And Louis's great-grandson is, in fact, going to become the next king of Spain. So there will be a Bourbon king in Spain. And there is, however, at the Treaty of Utrecht, an agreement that says that the kingdoms of Spain and France will never be joined, were never to be joined. And in fact, they never were joined as a result of this treaty. So while you have a Bourbon king in France, you're going to have a Bourbon king in Spain. So this family, the Bourbon family, is very powerful, but they're not able to join their territories as the Habsburgs had done back in the 16th century. So we're going to end with this and look at Louis XIV, the zenith of absolutism in Europe. Louis set the standard that others would follow in nations such as Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Naples. And you can see Louis there being about to be crowned with the laurel wreath, something we saw back in the Renaissance with Petrarch, by an angel. And he is on horse, which is a symbol, again, man on a horse is a symbol of one's power and authority. And you can see him pictured there in his various costumes, if you will, that are meant to inspire awe and project his authority and his power to all around him. So I think with that, we'll end this lecture. And if you have any questions, again, please write them down. It's always great to have questions. And I want to end with this quote. This gentleman that you see pictured here, the Duc de Simon, wrote a memoir of his life at Versailles. So he was one of those nobles that went to live at the Palace of Versailles. And he writes this: he loved splendor, that is Louis XIV. He loved splendor, magnificence, and profusion in all things, and encouraged similar tastes in his court. To spend money freely on equipages, in buildings, on feasting, and at cards was a sure way to gain his favor, perhaps to obtain the honor of a word from him. End quote. And I think that sort of captures the essence of Louis's court, the splendor, the magnificence, the profusion, that is the greatness in all things, spending money on buildings, on finery, on clothing, on food, on parties, festivities, etc., was something that went into the idea of projecting one's power and a sense of power. And I think we still see some of this today, that the trappings of power haven't really changed. Now, we live in a constitutional democracy. There are checks and balances and limitations on our elected officials who are elected. It's not a dynasty, but I think if one even considers, for example, now President-elect Trump, and the fact that he is a wealthy person who lives in a gilded condominium in the center of New York in Trump Tower, one sees this idea of, again, the magnificence, the splendor, the visible signs of wealth. So the outward visible signs that seem to connect to an inward idea of projecting power, projecting certainty, projecting confidence. And Louis had all of that. His words didn't work out. Maybe his ambitions were, in fact, too big, but he does sort of set the stage for other absolutist rulers who will follow and imitate him. So I think then he is successful in that. So if there are any questions, please jot them down. Thank you.